Welcome to They Live by Film, a film discussion podcast focused on the Criterion Channel and beyond. My name's Adam Lundy, and I am joined as always by Chris Haskell and Zach Bryant. How are you doing today, guys?
Hello.
Hey, how's it going?
How are you guys doing today? Very going good, going well.
Oh man, yeah, I'm doing great.
No COVID yet.
Awesome. That's what we
Zach,
like to see.
have Zach or Adam, have y'all been gotten the vaccine yet?
I'm on the list.
Gosh, no. I was only telling Zach before we started recording, we are way behind. I probably won't see a vaccine till the end of the summer if I'm lucky.
Oh, okay.
So we'll see how it goes. Well, we got a bit of a bumper episode in store for you guys today. We have three movies to talk about rather than our usual two, as well as a nice little special feature about halfway through the podcast. So definitely keep an eye out for that. We're just going to jump straight in. So the first film we're talking about today is a Chinese film from the director's name is, I'm going to mispronounce this, but it's Zhangke Jia. It's a Chinese director, and the film is called Xiao Wu. English title is called Pickpocket from 1998. Just to give you a sort of brief synopsis on this from IMDb, a small town pickpocket whose friends have moved on to higher trades finds himself bitter and unable to adapt. Yeah, it's a pretty straightforward rundown of what this film is. Any of you guys want to sort of pick up on any sort of early points on this?
If you know, one thing that I just thought would be maybe some interesting historical context on Chris here that ties directly into this movie. So, 1998, there was a political revolution in Indonesia. I was living, and we actually had to evacuate. So we had 3 hours to leave our house, pick what we needed, and like get out because they were targeting Americans. And we were sitting in Singapore in the summertime, and we were watching on TV this transition from Hong Kong from the British to the Chinese. So this, it's interesting coming back, watching this now in 2021. I brought back this flood of memories, and it was really, I loved seeing that perspective of everything that was going on in 1998 from the perspective of kind of a smaller town in more rural China. So that was, anyways, just a little context of for me as I was watching this movie, it was a bit personal and kind of brought back some fun memories about that time.
I'm gonna sound like such an asshole during my part of the review now.
Oh, that was the intent, Zach. I'm trying to.
Oh, good, good,
That's what
good.
I try to do. So mission 2 minutes out of the gate. Um, but yeah, we can talk more about the film itself. I just wanted to, kind of. Anyways, this film was a bit
That's really
personal.
cool though. I had that's brings a lot of interesting perspective to it.
Yeah, I think this film obviously has a lot of very heavy historical context. It's kind of like I compared this in my written review. I compared it to like the Czech New Wave, in terms of like what it was trying to say politically, while also just having the characters kind of do very little. It really reminded me of that, and I suppose having historical context for this kind of film would probably give it an extra layer. But like I knew very little of the historical context, and I adored this film. I loved everything about it. Um, yeah, like I said, I kind of love films that have a kind of easygoing nature, but are still trying to say something. That's just not too in your face. Like essentially, this film, that the main character in it, is like it's kind of just one of these guys that just never really grew up. He's sort of stuck living in, his teenage years where he used to just be a pickpocket and josh around with his friends, and they've all kind of grown up and moved on, and they're trying to become legit businessmen. Even if some of them are still a little bit skeevy, they're trying to do it like a bit more legit than he is, and that sort of focus on the sort of stunted growth and how this character will essentially be thrown out by the new regime because he refuses to work within that regime really sort of speaks to how China was developing around that time, and around um was it Mao? I can't remember the name of the, no, maybe not Mao. Whatever the name of the leader of China at that time. I'm pretty sure it was Mao, but I couldn't be 100%. But yeah, during that sort of transitional period in Chinese history when things were going, a bit more like they are today with a stricter regime, um, this sort of character was sort of almost left behind by it.
Yeah, the president. Let's see. Yeah, the president was Mao. You're right at that time. Or let's see. Yeah. No, it was Jiang Zemin. That's right. At that time, it was Jiang Zemin.
Okay.
Anyways, but yeah, there was a lot going on. But I think that just one interesting thing to kind of touch on here was this idea of globalization, right? So there was some American product placement
Yeah.
in the film. I think Marlboro cigarettes was the big one that they kind of were kind of talking about, getting excited about trying, and they're willing to pay more for it because it was this American cigarette, even though we all know that Marlboro's like, I think one of the guys in the film even said it's like, this is the cheapest thing in the US. But it was, it's interesting, like this perception that because something's from America or England or Ireland, like, and it's in China now, all of a sudden it's super exciting, right? Because this has been a relatively closed off country. So it's got a little bit of that romanticism kind of tied to it.
Well, it's like also in that part about the when somebody's trying to buy the radio.
Yes.
And they're talking about it was built there, and I was like, from perspective of my life, I've always heard don't buy things that were made in China, but it was kind of a funny little thing to tie that in as well.
Mm-hmm. I think the radio as well ties into the role that media plays, not just obviously in modern life as well, and also in the film. Like, I don't really recall, I think you watched it more recently than I did, Zach. I don't really recall there being like a traditional soundtrack to the film. Pretty much all like the music and the sounds you hear are from within the film's realm. So
yeah, there's a word for that, and I really can't remember it. It's sort of the dia. Oh man, whenever all the sounds are just from there, there's no external score. I can't think of the word for it now, but yeah, I don't remember there being a score at all.
Yeah, maybe during the credits or something there was, but yeah, pretty much all the music you hear during the actual main plot is all from within the film, whether it's like the karaoke bar or even just sort of flashes you hear when the character's walking through places. You'll hear like things from TV or from radios and stuff like that, and this sort of idea that media is sort of surrounding you and you can't really escape the media, even though he's in this sort of small rundown village. Even they're being constantly bombarded by radio, TV, movies, music. There's no real escape from it, and that sort of idea of commercialism, and especially in this era in the 90s where things were becoming so much more commercialized, and especially TV and radio and things like that, which were before that were seen more of a novelty or something that you can get by without, whereas in the 90s and then the turn into the 2000s it pretty much became something you couldn't really live without. You couldn't live without TV or radio or hearing sounds constantly wherever you are, and this film really represents that well. And it kind of reminded me of One Kar Wai in a bit, especially Chungking Express, which was made a few years prior to this, because like in Chungking Express, music is everywhere and it's always music from within the film's world, like California Dreaming, like constantly playing, for example, in the second story. See, I just found this film was trying to say a ton without actually doing a lot within the actual action of the film, and I love that. I love a film that says a lot without doing a lot. I think that's the best kind of film. If you're trying to stuff too much stuff in and have your character do too many things just to try and get a point across, I think you've missed the point. If you have a film like this, which is so easygoing, it's so easy to watch, while also making really great points about the world, I think you have a knockout of a film.
Yeah, absolutely. My memory of this is that he was not a very good pickpocket. Is that so?
He got obviously he got caught towards the end, but I'm trying to recall if he got caught at the start as well.
I was more thinking, okay, so when he got caught and he was in the police station, it just sounded to me like he'd been caught many times before, right?
Yeah, he was kind of a regular there, but now that everything's kind of changing on the crackdown of criminals, it was a bigger deal than it was every other time.
Yeah, and if that's true, then I think it's interesting of what director Zhang Ki, I guess, was saying, was that, like, this idea of kind of being stuck when the world is moving on, like, people are willing to be stuck even if they're not good at the thing that they're being stuck in. Right?
Yeah, it's just that unwillingness to grow or change. It kind of
status quo.
Yeah, it's kind of like Ivitaloni in that sense as well.
Yeah.
The way the guys in that film just sort of they're just happy, just plodding along. Well, the majority of them, obviously, there's that one guy who wants to move on, but the majority of the characters in Ivitaloni are happy enough just sort of plodding along with their easy existence in their small town, and the character of Xiao is kind of similar in that regard. Like he has no real interest in moving on. Like, he's even happy to sort of lose his friends and lose his family just because he just wants to keep doing what he knows.
I think that was kind of the most difficulty I had with the film. And Chris, now that I reread your review, I almost wonder if I thought of that, like subconsciously, I was thinking of that Jim Jarmusch comparison.
Yeah.
But it was really hard for me to stay engaged. And I don't know if that's why. I'm not a huge, like, Jarmusch fan either. A couple of his things I really like I like Dead Man. But that whole, like, things just sort of happen. And there's really no connective tissue, or at least not a lot of one. It really made me struggle a little bit to stay engaged. I don't want to sit here and like bag on the film because I did love the look of it. I think the blocking of the scenes and the directing all looked really good, and it made me want to go watch Ash is the Whitest Color, which I know he put out a couple years ago, which I already was interested in. But if nothing else, this film's like, okay, I actually really want to watch that. But this one, it just left me a little cold, I guess. Is the best way to put it.
Don't ever watch a short TV show that Jarmusch made called Fishing with John.
I think I'm going to avoid it anyway.
It's just a bunch of his friends, and they like just take trips going fishing, and like just talking on a boat, and that's it. Nothing happens. But I mean, I love it. It's like
I think it's a certain like Adam, you were kind of talking about too. You like that laid back feeling, and sometimes. And it could be a mood thing, and that really could have been if I was in that more laid back situation, and I would have been like, "Oh, fantastic, great." But for me, when I watched it this time, I was just like, I just can't get engaged. Like, I don't like the main character. I just didn't like him. I don't know why.
I don't think suppose he's supposed to be likable, but again, I can understand why that would sort of help with the disengagement or help you not become engaged if you don't like the character. But yeah, I don't think he's supposed to be likable. I think he's just supposed to be like this sort of, I suppose maybe loser is a harsh word, but he is kind of a loser. But yeah, like I can't really speak too much on the Jarmusch comparison because I've only seen one Jarmusch film. I did really like it. Is that I can't remember the name.
Ghost Dog?
No, it's one with John Laurie, and it's a black and white one. I'm pretty sure it might have been his first feature film.
Is it Down by Law?
No, it's something about a vacation. Something vacation.
It's like it's not Dead Man. That's the only black and white of one of his I've seen.
He does a great one called Coffee and Cigarettes, but
that's the Vignette one, isn't it? Where there's like just a bunch of guys talking. Stranger Than Paradise. Sorry, that's.
I love that movie.
Yeah, that's really good. I need to watch more Jarmusch because I watched that and I really liked that, and I suppose it has a similar feel. It's just a bunch of sort of kind of like just I don't know, calling them criminals kind of feels harsh because when you say someone's a criminal, it makes you feel like they're maybe like antagonistic, but these guys aren't. They're just kind of, and calling them losers is kind of harsh too. But they kind of thread that line in between criminal and
a little deviant.
Yeah, this little deviant, and that's what this reminded me of as well. This sort of, this guy he just can't get out. He doesn't even really want to get out of the situation that he's in. He's just happy, sort of plodding along.
Well, he just feels so like. And I know this is the point, but the whole time the film is telling him straight up that if he doesn't change, it's not going to end well. Like it's all around him the entire movie. Yeah. And then it's like at the end, you're like, well, yeah, if you paid attention like one time or had any like inkling to sit there and say, and I know that's the point. And to me, it's just like, he doesn't deserve what happens to him at all. Cause it doesn't end well for him. It's the punishment doesn't fit the crime sort of thing, but it's just like, it's just frustrating.
We have a saying here in Ireland. I don't know if you guys have ever come across it, but it's play stupid games, win stupid prizes.
Right,
and that's kind of how this kind of feels as well. Like you're saying, if he had just, because his friends talk him through this whole way to saying like he needs to grow up. The fact that he wasn't invited to one of his former best friend's wedding because of his continued deviant behavior, and his friend who runs a shop is telling him he can't keep doing this kind of stuff. His family want him to stop. Everyone's kind of saying, all the signs are pointing to him saying, get your life together, Xiao Wu.
And I think he has such a support. He does have a support system in some sense. Like it deals a lot with loneliness, but there are people who generally want him to be okay, whether or not they're close to him or in an intimate situation with him. He could probably have that type of relationship if he would just clean himself up a little bit, just a tad, where people would want to be around him a little bit more.
Yeah, but but speaking of relationship, before we move on to the romance part, yeah, so Adam, you mentioned I Vitelloni earlier.
Yeah.
So last night I finished another Fellini film called Il Bidone, which is like The
Oh, I've
Swindler.
heard of it. Yeah.
Uh, it's really good. I think people don't like it as much because the ending feels very self-indulgent and kind of awkward. I think it's probably the worst.
Self-indulgent in a Fellini film?
If you can imagine,
Can I can't.
you can imagine. Um, uh, but that is actually way more similar in tone, I think, to Xiao, because I totally agree with you that Eva Toloni, like that's the main theme of people that are stuck, right? But I don't think it's quite as focused on like one character as compared to others. It's sort of, like this whole community is just kind of stuck. So Il Bidone deals with a guy, or focuses on a guy who's in his late 40s, and he's one of the last of the original swindlers or kind of scam artists, con men in the city, and his friends are starting to move on and have careers and stuff, and it's his kind of existential thing that he's dealing with. So in that way, I think it's similar. But
Oh yeah, sounds very similar.
yeah. But there's this thing that happens in China, and I hope this doesn't get us banned in China because I know we have a lot of listeners there. But there's this thing that happens when you are part of a society where you're told that, now we're doing things different, right? It's like, now, like there's multiple examples you can kind of pull up in your everyday life where it's just like, well, we don't do that anymore, and you're expected to just kind of move on and change with society. So now they even have, I don't know if y'all have heard about this, but they have a social score. So it's kind of like a credit rating, but it's on you as an individual, the kind of friends you hang out with, like the job you have, you actually get a score as like a human. And when you go apply for jobs, like that score follows you.
That's insane.
Yeah. So, not to get too political, but like imagine, so this is sort of like a story. It's a fairly rebellious story, actually, told from the perspective of somebody who's kind of rejecting this idea that they have to change just because people around them are telling them they have to change, right? And so I think in that way, it was I love the rebelliousness and sort of the bravery of it. I have you all heard of this artist called Ai Weiwei?
No.
Anyways, he's sort of like he does big like $10 million installations around the world kind of things. But he's been imprisoned at least twice and sent to like correction camp at least twice. And he'll just disappear for 3 months, and he'll come back. And after he comes back, he's very quiet about politics. And then after a few years goes by, he can't help himself. But it's not a culture where you're supposed to have strong like anti sort of government views. So I think the fact that he did this in a subtle way was maybe a reason that he was able to kind of get away with some of the messages in here. And I think that people in China would have understood what he was saying a little bit more than we would have.
Ni hao to our listeners in China, friends of the podcast. The people of China are the friends of the podcast. The government of China, not so much. I suppose just in terms of the direction, then that was one thing that really jumped out at me. Like I love the look of this film. Like 16mm film to me just looks gorgeous. I love the look of 16mm. It's just the colors, the grain. It's just perfect. It's the perfect format. And I thought the direction was really interesting in terms of the very two contrasting styles that the director employs throughout the film. So a lot of the time when Xiao or the characters are sort of walking around the city, or I say city, but walking around the streets and things like that, it's very up close and personal, sort of handheld dolly shots, kind of very, very maybe even sort of French New Wave or even like Italian neo-realist, just very DIY. But then he just completely switches styles during like interior scenes to like an almost Otsu sort of very still, very static camera, barely moves, long shots that go on for like 5+ minutes of just characters talking. And it was just a really interesting contrast. And it kept me very much engaged throughout the film because there was so much difference. Sometimes when you, like with an Osu film, I don't know, this is probably sacrilege, but sometimes in an Osu film, I find myself getting a little bored because the camera doesn't really move a whole lot and because the shots are all very samey. Like Ozu, he has his Like he has his niche and he's good at it, but it gets a little bit tedious over 90 minutes for me. So the fact that this director had, I don't want to say gall. It wasn't like he made the most daring choice ever, but the fact that he made the choice to be able to employ two very different styles of camera work, both the sort of more DIY moving about with the camera, and then also knowing when to just stay still and let the scenes flow and let the characters just talk and just come together just to flesh out their characters. Yeah, I think the director did an incredible job. Like I know one of the guys in our podcast or one of the guys in our Discord talked very highly of the director. I'd never heard of him. I'd never heard of any of his films, but I definitely am going to go watch more after seeing this, 'cause I think he did an incredible job from a direction point of view.
Yeah. The only other thing that was on my mind to talk about was how everything that we've been discussing was displayed as a metaphor through the relationship with the women in the film, right?
Oh yeah, I think we should. Yeah, we probably could touch on this a little bit more actually, because obviously, I suppose one of the central plot points of this is the inverted commas romance between Xiao Wu and the. Is she a prostitute? The synopsis says she's a prostitute, but
it certainly feels like that because she lives with like those other women, and like it feels like their main job is to be available for men.
But like, she only gets paid to sing karaoke with Xiao Wu. That's the only thing we ever see her sort of getting paid to do something, is to sing karaoke with him, from what I recall.
I mean, I think that's why she's a bit confused in the beginning, right? Because she even kind of asked him a little bit, like, "This is what you want to do?"
Okay, so maybe I missed this. Maybe this is just what Xiao Wu wants to do rather than what her actual profession is.
Yeah. So this is what like inspired Deuce Bigalow, that whole thing where he's just like he basically gets paid to talk to women and then he gets charged with prostitution.
I forgot that Deuce Bigalow was it Deuce Bigalow European Gigolo, is that, or American?
It's just the first one is just God.
Deuce
Now I'm getting
Male Gigolo is the title of the first one.
Yeah, Male Gigolo.
Oh, so there's two. Okay, right.
Yeah, they made two of those for some reason.
Okay, I forgot it existed.
It's the trilogy, actually. Xiao Wu is the first one, and then Deuce Bigalow.
Oh, I thought Deuce Bigalow was the American remake. Okay, that makes sense. Women in this film are not really very prominent, other than that character, though, right? Like, obviously, they have. I suppose if this is a bordello, then you have the madam, who's sort of friendly with Xiao Wu until he starts getting a bit belligerent, and then she tells him to get out. And then obviously you have his mother, who's, from what I recall, just sort of very quiet. It's really his father that gets onto him when Xiao Wu won't shape up. Women aren't as prevalent in this, and I don't know if if it's just a cultural thing or just for the sake of the film, there just didn't need to be a lot of women in it. Because, I know we shouldn't really compare, say Chinese films to Japanese films because it's different culture. It's like comparing apples and oranges, but you do see female roles a lot more fleshed out in Japanese films, and like Osu, for example. Again, if I was just to give another brief example of a Japanese director that does feature a lot of women, this film didn't really feature a lot of women except for that character, the love interest, if you'll call her that.
If the character of Xiao was anything like the director, then I imagine he's not comfortable with women. But also, I think he was known in that community, right? And I think that's something that in a lot of more rural or really just in China, it kind of in general, until you get into the huge cities, there is a much more of a sense of like a community and kind of being known. So I think maybe the focus was not so much on like any individual person, like it wasn't a story about him and the police chief or him and the mother or him, but I think maybe for me it was just a little bit more of like how his kind of role in the community, even though he's kind of disgraced a little bit, like he's still known and they still put up with him.
I suppose it kind of ties into another film we're going to talk about later with sort of a particular character who is known in the community, maybe not very well liked in the community. So that will tie into one of the films that we'll talk about later on, I suppose.
Definitely.
All right. In this segment, we're going to be talking about The American Friend. It's about Tom Ripley, who deals in forged art, suggests a picture framer he knows would make a good hitman. Just I guess a good way to start. Has either of you guys seen Purple Noon or The Talented Mr. Ripley? Have you been familiar with the character before this?
Not at all.
No, unfortunately not.
I knew of him. I knew Talented Mr. Ripley. I know Purple Moon with is it Delon? Is it Alan Delon?
Yeah.
Is in that? Yeah, I knew of it, but no, this is my first exposure to Tom Ripley.
I've only seen the Matt Damon one, which I liked. Actually, it was kind of interesting to watch this because that one kind of deals with a young Mr. Ripley, and this one's kind of like supposed to be, I guess, a more seasoned one. He's kind of went into himself. So we won't make too many comparisons to that, especially since you guys haven't seen it. But what did you guys think?
Well, I started my review this way. Maybe I'll just kind of start this as well. But before we get into the movie, I just kind of like this is a good opportunity to celebrate Patricia Highsmith. She's so great. Like the person who wrote the novel, like the Ripley ad, right, about her. I think I just put this list together. It just takes like 10 seconds here, but she's if you look at the directors that have adapted her work, it's Hitchcock, Wenders, Todd Haynes, Anthony Minghella, Chabrol, Rene Clement. And then the characters of Tom Ripley specifically have been Alain Delon, Dennis Hopper, Malkovich, Matt Damon. Like, she really has captured the mind of directors and kind of creative people that want to work in this crime genre, right? And I love most of her stories are fantastic, and I think for me this was no exception. I think the timing of when events happened and how Ripley inserted himself into the story, and you see the character who's dying of some disease or maybe not dying, you're not sure, being manipulated by these forces around him to become essentially a hitman, even though he's not wanting to. And then the way that Ripley plays into that story and the timing of it all just felt very well crafted, and I loved it.
Well, the thing that's kind of always interesting about Tom Ripley as a character is even though Damon and Hopper play the character completely different, one thing I think they both have in common is in a lot of ways they feel unassuming. Like, yeah, they both seem quirky and unusual and not quite right, but no one you could feel like could be in control of like these events. And I think it really plays into that, especially how Hopper does such a great job. I love him and everything, but I think he really played this character with the uncanny valley sort of feel to it, like almost feels robotic in the way he acts and almost like a forced human sort of way, especially that laugh.
Yeah, like I'll go on. I'll just start it off saying I really, really loved the film. It was incredible. I loved the look of it. I thought Wenders did a great job directing. The cinematographer, Robbie Mueller, who, to tie into what we were just talking about, is actually a cinematographer for a ton of Jim Jarmusch movies. He like the most like some of the most famous Jim Jarmusch movies. Robbie Mueller was cinematographer on those too. They created this film that just looks so cool, and the way they craft it with the shots and everything like that. It's not like a typical actiony, crimey movie, but it just has so much atmosphere and so much tension in every scene.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was really incredible. Dennis Hopper was great, like perfectly described, like so uncanny. It's just odd to watch him. His eyes, for me, is what got me throughout the film. He just had these eyes as someone who could just like look through your soul, but like the rest of his face was just kind of like aloof, like he wasn't even really there. It was it's just such an odd performance, but it was so captivating. But for me, it was Bruno Ganz. He was the star of the show for me. He was like, he's obviously one of the greatest European actors to have ever worked in film, but he gave such a restrained human performance, but really with this really sort of undercutting layer of sadness throughout the whole film, because obviously his character's predicament where he may or may not have a terminal illness and he's being manipulated. But yeah, I thought the film, just in terms of its craft, like its story, I think it's fine. Like I don't think people will watch this film for its plot. It's fine. But it's just it's a pretty sort of standard crime plot. But I think how the film is constructed and how the plot is unfolded is what the sort of really great thing about this is.
Yeah, I love the way that Hopper also transitions into Maniac. Like I'm thinking specifically of that scene on the train.
Yes, he was wide-eyed.
Yeah, right. And all of a sudden, Zimmerman's not going to be able to pull off the task, and you see that Ripley's been watching him the whole time, and he comes in and finishes the job. It's the first glimpse you get into that sort of other side of him, like you're talking about, Zach, right? Because otherwise, it's not there.
With this film as well, this is another one kind of like, well, not similar to Xiao for most of it, but what really made this film tick as well was the very minimal score.
Mm-hmm.
The way it was just very sort of low droning sounds for a lot of it. Towards the end, I felt like as the plot picked up, the score did as well. But initially, during the early stages, the score really helped the tension. It was just low and it was monotonous and it just kind of set you on edge, kind of like in a horror film in a way. They used music very similar to in a horror film to sort of build tension and to, put you on the edge of your seat and to build atmosphere. So, yeah, I think I may have read this maybe I'm confusing it with a different film, but I remember I thought I read in a review somewhere that a lot of the filmmaking techniques, obviously film noir, huge influence on this film, both sort of obvious and not obvious, which I touched on in my review. The film, obviously, like literally you have two of the powerhouse film noir directors in the film, like Nicholas Ray and Sam Fuller are both act in the film, so you can't really get as overt as that. But also there is some aspects in terms of how it was filmed, with some of the deaths and the way it builds tension. Is very similar to maybe like a 70s horror film as well. I don't know if any of you got that kind of vibe off it, even though it's not a horror film, but it did have that vibe a lot of the time as well, that sort of existentialist atmosphere, dread that sort of permeates through the scenes.
Yeah, I think it's because Zimmerman feels so out of control, and that's kind of a big part of 70s horror is the lack of control, because in a lot of ways, Ripley could come off as a slasher villain, but he just manipulates people to do things instead of doing things himself.
Mm-hmm. So, what do y'all think about this idea that Zimmerman was actually kind of being groomed, like in the way that was best for him? I know that sounds weird because he's talking about being a killer, but I just felt that, like, the scenes where he was at home, he seemed like a bit lost to me. And then the scenes where he was on the road, he kind of seemed to come alive a little bit, right? He was awkward at first, but then near the end of the movie, I feel like him and Ripley were almost like buddies at times.
I think Ripley, I haven't read any of the books, so I don't know if this is the intention by the author. He just always seems like a person who's so good at reading what people need. And he manipulates them to that. He knows something's missing in this guy's life, and he, from the moment like he sees the broken frame, and when the guy's like breaking the frame and the thing and everything else, he's starting to figure out that he can manipulate this guy, and he works towards that. And what's that old expression, like bring people in with honey instead of vinegar sort of thing, give them what they want. Don't, never feel like he's forcing his hand. He's doing what he feels like he needs to.
Well, and in this case, that includes actually sending him to a doctor in the various cities that he wants him to kill somebody in, right?
Yeah, exactly. For me, this is kind of where the plot gets a little bit loosey-goosey, because the film is either incredibly subtle or maybe I'm just blind, but like we're not really told or given really any insight as to why Zimmerman would even go ahead with any of this. Yeah, okay, he's promised money for his family to be left behind, but we're not really told much about his character beforehand, or like it's one thing, okay, you're dying and you want to make sure your family is gonna be stable and you want money, but it's a lot to sort of leap to say, okay, I'm gonna murder a couple of people to make sure that happens. That's a big leap to take from one to the other, and we're not really given any idea, or we're not given any inkling as to why Zimmerman would be okay with doing this, because he's obviously very inexperienced, as we can see in the first murder, the way he just completely just keeps sort of
he ignores all the advice.
Yeah, and he just he ignores all the advice, and he misses so many opportunities to just do it. He kind of delays it until he can't really delay it any further. So he's obviously inexperienced. So sometimes in these kind of films, you'll maybe see there'll be some kind of like background where the character maybe he has killed before and it was an accident, or maybe he's had these urges before in the past, and maybe that's why he's okay to sort of jump to this conclusion that this is how he's going to get the money for his family. But we're not really given that inkling with Jonathan. He's just from what we can tell, he's just an everyday guy who makes picture frames, who suddenly, when finds out he probably is going to die, he's like, well, I better go kill a few people to make sure my family have money. I just think it's a big leap, and it doesn't really detract from the film, because I think the whole film is very sort of loose, and I think the film is more about his atmosphere than it is about the actual semantics of the plot, because a lot of, like, if you were to really sort of bear down and analyze the plot, a lot of it's just completely nonsensical. So this is one of the films where sort of like I don't know if you guys have seen The Passenger from Antonioni. Another really, really similar film in this sense to the vibe. It's more about the vibe than the plot, because again, the plot and The Passenger is just completely nonsensical. But it's just more about the atmosphere, and it's kind of like this. It's kind of like a quiet thriller. I'd say if you guys like this, you'll like The Passenger. Jack Nicholson plays the lead. It was one of Antonioni's English films, or well, it was American, but it was made in English, is what I mean. And yeah, I think with this film, I don't want to analyze the plot too much, because a lot of it's very loose, and it's more about the atmosphere than how characters have gotten from A to B.
The only thing I'll say is that I did like that ambiguity, from the sense that they keep hinting that this guy has a background that would lead him to become a hitman, but they never talk about it really or go into it.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that allows some fun. Fun's probably not the right word, but like you can kind of play the edge pretty well and keep people on the edge of their seat pretty well, and like not just uncertain and unsure. And then it even goes a step further when his wife, like, very quickly adapts to the idea of what he's doing, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's another thing. Like, she just literally was like, "Oh, you're killing guys? Okay, I'll drive the car." It's just, it's why characters go from A to B is not the most important thing in this film. I think it's just taking it all in and enjoying the ride.
Maybe, I don't know if this is like an intention of the film, but it almost feels like a part of it feels almost like an American invasion in Germany sort of thing. Like the idea that Ripley, he's very very obviously American. The cowboy hat is just going to give it away every time, and I feel like that's on purpose.
Well, he calls himself the cowboy in Berlin. Near the start of the film, he says he's going to be the cowboy in Berlin.
Yeah, and this idea that he's kind of having this parasitic relationship with Bruno Ganz's character Zimmerman, who's this German situation in a sense, and he's just kind of latched onto it to manipulate his own thing. And you kind of mentioned globalization in the last film we talked about, Chris, and I can kind of see that here as well in a sense.
And he's probably smoking Marlboros, right? So
yeah, probably.
These are both his anti-cigarette movies.
Yeah, like I suppose like this film mainly takes place in Berlin. Like at this point, the Berlin Wall was still up. Like we assume this takes place in East Berlin rather than West Berlin. So obviously, yeah, Americanization would have been very much tied with the Berlin culture, because obviously it sort of fell on the Allied side after everything was split up. So yeah, for sure you could see that, like you said, this sort of symbiotic or parasitic relationship between the American character coming in and getting his claws on this German character to get him to kill very much could be sort of looked at as a wider sort of a metaphor for the way America likes to meddle in other countries' shit. So, that definitely, and I don't know if that's, like I said, I don't know. I've never read any of the books. I didn't know a whole lot about the series.
And this came out in 1977, right?
Yeah, 1977.
So we're talking about not that long after the pullout in Vietnam either.
That's true, yeah. Now, the original book that this is based on, is this also set in Germany?
I did a little reading about the kind of the deal with it. It almost sounds like he took a couple different plots from, he took like two plots from two different books, because most of them were taken up by other studios who were going to do stuff with them and probably never did or waited forever to do it. And I know it said that one of them did not have permission to use it. He used plots from it anyway, and then mixed it with another book.
I see.
So if you want a data point to support what you just said, Zach, I think that's a really cool theory, actually. If you want a data point, the author, Patricia Highsmith, was born in Texas. and ended up dying in Switzerland.
Okay.
So she probably had, I mean, if we're going to make some assumptions here, she might have had that view that like freaking Americans, coming in and like meddling with the European stuff.
America liked to meddle in other countries' shit, as I said before. So yeah, I could definitely see that as being like an overarching sort of metaphor for, America going in and manipulating other countries to do its bidding, basically. So yeah, it's definitely an excellent point.
And it was before they did the whole Afghan war with the Soviet Union sort of thing. So it almost is prophetic. Is that a word?
We can make it a word. Yeah, for sure. This is completely off on a crazy tangent, but just because you mentioned the Afghani war with the Soviets, I always find it funny. Is it in Rambo 3 or one of the Rambo films that
3?
Yeah, that follows that war? There's like a dedicated to the brave fighters of the Mujahideen, which is Al Qaeda, and I always find that hilarious.
Well, the hilarious thing about 3, and I won't make this tangent too long, but essentially that whole movie was made in a sense for support of, the Afghans against the Soviets, since basically we had forced them into their own Vietnam War to bankrupt them. And the bad thing was, it was to get support for that. Well, the Soviets pulled out like not long before this movie went into theaters. Like they were filming while they were still there, and by the time it released, no one really cared anymore. The situation was over. It was done. The pullout had already started, and so it ended up kind of falling on deaf ears altogether.
And then the producers said, "Thanks, Al Qaeda. You're very brave."
It's a metaphor for the importance of pulling out.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Collection Corner. So we have a really kind of fun special edition here where we actually were able to get the second interview with a boutique distribution house. This one is a passion project. You'll hear more about it shortly, but from Jonathan, who works for Kino Lorber and has a passion project he's building out for called Fun City Editions, which has a partnership with Vinegar Syndrome for distribution. So anyways, very excited for this interview. And just quickly before we get into it, I'll kind of tease coming up. We have some interviews in April that are going to be coming out possibly early May, depending on when they drop. It's going to be, one of them is with a brand new label that doesn't have any releases yet, called Error 4444, which is going to be Asian horror and genre movies. Super excited to interview them. And the other one, which is with Cauldron Films, which is a passion project from the creators of Diabolic DVD. I'm sure we'll be talking about their new releases, Crimes of the Black Cat and Beyond Terror, which hit after 3 months of production delays because of COVID. So I have to imagine they're excited to finally get those out. But yeah, without further ado, very excited to talk to Jonathan Hertzberg. So, just by way of by introduction, Jonathan Hertzberg, currently the owner and founder of Fun City Editions, which is a distribution partner with Vinegar Syndrome. But 3 current releases in the market on Blu-ray. From what I can tell, you have a big passion for theatrical, Blu-ray, and then it seems like also soundtracks and kind of music. So I want to dig into that here in a minute. Mm-hmm. Your background, from what I can tell, you were with Kino Lorber for a while, as well as in before that Chicago Film Festival. Did I get that right?
Yeah, I'm actually still with I still am with Kino Lorber. Okay. Yeah, even though I've got Fun City, I'm still maintaining my my duties at Kino Lorber, where I run, or I help curate and market and sell the Kino Lorber repertory line. It's sort of like it's a Kino Lorber sub label. I work on the theatrical sales side. So these are all restorations, re-releases of older titles, classic titles, lesser known would-be classic titles. And Kino Lorber, we released those theatrically. In the pandemic era, we're doing virtual theatrical like anyone else, but normally, we're playing in art house theaters around the country, film festivals, museums, and whatnot. And then those titles eventually, end up streaming. and on home video, and Kino has obviously a big home video component to the company. So I sort of help on the in my role there. I'm working on the theatrical side and launching those classic titles, and then they go on and do their own thing on the other platforms. With Fun City, I'm ostensibly doing the theatrical, if I have theatrical rights, and the digital sales and the home video. So the first few films have been just Blu-ray. They've just been home video.
So I guess in Fun City, as you're kind of getting going here, I just saw Jeremy last night actually, but previously I had seen I Start Counting and Alphabet City.
Wow! You're all caught up. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
First of all, for checking them out, for supporting. Did you enjoy Jeremy? Did you enjoy the other titles as well, or you can?
Yeah. No, totally. So Alphabet City is like just oozes cool, basically, right? It's like mood and atmosphere and cool. It puts you right in that moment. We were talking about, before we started recording, we were talking a little bit about like film being able to kind of be a timepiece or like a documentary almost in a sense. And like, I feel like Alphabet City is that perfectly. And then I Start Counting was kind of the same thing, but like in a totally different, it didn't have the same sort of, 80s aesthetic, but it put in that kind of sleepy English, sort of country almost kind of setting.
Yeah. You're right. The environment in those films is key, and they do transport you. They do feel like there's almost as much. Alphabet City, I think, is almost like more overtly stylized, and I Start Counting is more subtle about it, but it's kind of like sneaky in terms of its production design and utilizing the surrounding environs. But yeah, it's a good point that I didn't think about that so much when I was selecting these films, but that is pretty. And that's one of the nice things about the upgrade to HD or better. Because these are films, especially I Start Counting, which has never been available in a decent version up until now. As far as we can tell, I've heard some people say, there was a VHS release here or there in some part of the world, but I've never actually seen a physical proof of it. So I don't know if it's the first. It may be the first home video release anywhere. Certainly the first disc release. Anything that you've seen, there's bootlegs around and horrible YouTube rips.
Or maybe somebody has a film reel in their closet somewhere or something.
Someone what?
Like some collector probably has a film reel in their closet.
Yeah. I mean, there's a print in England. I know there's a print, but it really wasn't screened in the U.S. People in the U.S. really didn't know it. Even less. It was more of a cult film in England, and then here in the U.S. it was really not even that.
That's fun though, because Jenny Agutter kind of has a cult following to begin with, and then even beyond that, there's like this film is like a level deep of like kind of like a deep cut for her, deep track for her.
Yeah. Well, and that's something that I've sought out to do, is really try to find stuff that hasn't been done, that hasn't been released somewhere else, especially because I feel again, just starting out, like it's a lot easier to get attention for something, get some eyes on what you're doing if it's like, oh, this is a movie with Jenny Agutter from when she was right before she did Walkabout. It's kind of like this prime starring role for her, and it's really kind of unknown. It's been this sort of unknown quantity, so it draws more attention versus if I release something that's already come out before. I feel like then you really have to do something different to make it. It's got to be a brand new restoration, or you have to have some more additional extra features that haven't been released before. But for me, it's definitely been exciting to be really putting stuff out so far that hasn't been out. Maybe it's been on DVD, maybe not, but not on Blu-ray at the very least.
Well, I can tell you as a collector, just again, I think I kind of mentioned this when I was reaching out to you, but my background is not in film. I'm in kind of tech sales, and I just approach film as a hobby, and it's like sort of like my escape. And so the thing that I love, and one of the reasons when we started doing this podcast, which is kind of like a discussion about movies we watch throughout the week, and then we have a selection in the middle, which is this kind of collection corner. And the thing that's consistent for us is just this sort of passion for preservation. And there's not really, I mean, of course, there's ways we can plug into like support the local art house or support the local, in Austin, there's so many kind of film organizations. There's ways to plug into that. But even from a distance, there's a way to kind of like, support the preservation of like by buying Criterion or by buying Arrow Video. Then there's like a layer of films that companies that kind of come out like below that. They're like, hey, this business model works if you can kind of figure it out, right? And then you can go find Jeremy, and like it's this cool like kind of timepiece of New York. There's a scene in Jeremy that jumps out because it's so fresh, when he's waiting for the girlfriend, but he doesn't want her to kind of know that he's like waiting for her. Yeah. And so he sees her leaving the house, and he runs around the block and like catches her. So it just makes it seem like, oh, coincidence. Yeah. And there's that it just feels like such a New York moment. Like he's running around a building, and he knows where he's going to catch her on the other side of this building. Right.
Yeah. No, it's a great moment. And that was, there's a lot of handheld 16 millimeter in there. There's a lot of, he's interacting with real people on the street. They're not background extras. They're just people that were there. So it does feel very much ground street level. You are there, not a big Hollywood production. So
that's great.
Yeah, it has. So yeah. I mean, that's one of the ways I tried to kind of market it, as this very naturalistic, very very authentic, sort of having a sense of immediacy of New York at that time.
That's great. Yeah. One of the questions I was going to have for you, I think you kind of answered. So when I look at what's coming up next, just based on your website, you have Smile, which is an early Michael Ritchie film. I think right before he makes Bad News Bears, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. Which is amazing. Again, like one of those stories of like the film right before he kind of became like Michael Ritchie in a way, right? And then Rancho Deluxe, which is so funny because Frank Perry, I feel like, doesn't get enough love. But through the again, we're kind of circling around this topic of like collecting. Mm-hmm. Who was it? Somebody just put out a beautiful 3-disc special edition of The Swimmer.
That's right. Yeah. That's geez, I'm blanking right now.
No, it's okay.
But it's been around. That set's actually been around, and then they've reissued it a few times. But yes, it's fully loaded now. I think you can get the soundtrack. Yeah.
And then here, a few years later, let's see, Swimmer was 1968.
Oh, it's Grindhouse. Swimmer that was Grindhouse releasing.
Perfect. There you go. Yeah. Future friends of the podcast, we hope we're going to reach out to them too, because they do some crazy releases. But and then about 20 years later is Rancho Deluxe, or maybe 17 anyways, right around there. But it's cool.
It's Rancho Deluxe is 75, and The Swimmer was 68.
So, 10.
So it's not that it's. Yeah, I mean, he made a bunch of films in between, but they're fairly close.
Anyways, yeah. So there again, it's kind of like another film from this guy that's sort of getting some love in the boutique circuit right now. Yep. And then Walking the Edge, which I actually don't know too much about, but the tagline, "This cabbie ain't asking for no tips," just sounds awesome with Robert Forster in that role.
Yeah. Well, Walking the Edge is a good example of a title that's really been out of circulation for legitimately, it hasn't been streaming. It was released on DVD by Anchor Bay at the very beginning of DVD. Okay. It's been out of print for a long time. It fetches pretty high prices on the collector's market on eBay. And like I said, it hasn't been restored. It hasn't been remastered. It hasn't been updated for the Blu-ray HD era. So we're very, very excited to be able to be putting that back out. And it is very much like in some ways, it is kind of like a West Coast vigilante. If you saw the Bill Lustig film Vigilante, which was made about a year before Walking the Edge, that also stars Robert Forster, Joe Spinell. They both have scores by Jay Chataway. They both have a pretty sleazy, very violent very violent aesthetic, but Vigilante's in New York and Walking the Edge is in L.A. But they are really, I think they may be that Forster and Spinell went straight from straight from Vigilante to Walking the Edge, but Walking the Edge has been harder to see. So yeah, I'm excited about being able to put that one back out there, and I think it will, for those people that like Vigilante, that like the action films from that era, sort of those sleazier kind of genre stuff that's not horror, then they'll be in the Walking the Edge.
There's these beautiful sort of like moments in cinema history, right? Like people talk about like giallo films, or people talk about like the spaghetti westerns, and I think that like it seemed the way that you speak about the Fun City era. Like I was listening to a couple of interviews when you're talking about like I think it was a mayor or somebody was kind of like saying he wants to ride his bike, like it's a fun city to ride his bike in. Yes. And the journalists kind of picked up on that and were like, really? It's like super dangerous. But the films that were made around that era all had that kind of griminess to them a little bit, right? Like, it's very distinct.
Yeah, Fun City was an ironic name for New York at the time. It was because it was Mayor John Lindsay, and it was basically like his first day in office, and there was a transit strike going on, so he kind of stepped in it basically, and he said, well, I'm riding my bike around. I still think it's a fun city. And they just used that was just weaponized against him in the tabloids, and so Fun City became the nickname for the New York of that's the late 60s and through this into the 70s. But it kind of became like a forgotten term, a forgotten nickname in the last few decades. There's still some businesses in the city that use it. There's a tattoo place in the East Village called Fun City Tattoos, but it was the kind of thing that kind of, you would say to people of a certain, if they weren't of a certain generation, they wouldn't know what it was. But I was fascinated with that era. I had been obsessed with films that were shot there and documented it, and I created a series of video essays of compiling footage of films from that time period. I called it Dirty Old New York, aka Fun City. So that's sort of like it was kind of like a previous step leading to Fun City editions, I suppose. So yes, it's been like an obsession or a fascination of mine, and these are just different ways that it's been manifested. But Fun City editions, if I was only going to focus on New York movies, it would be limiting. So I'm not doing that. But it's a name that has that I have affinity for. So. It's fun to be able to. People don't know what it is. I'm still explaining it to people.
Yeah, and I think it's fun to take like the idea behind that, right? Which is like there was this moment in time that was meaningful for like a generation of people, and then you're going back and like capturing that moment, right? Yeah. And I think that's true for sure for at least what I've seen so far from what you've been able to put out.
Yeah, well, certainly a lot of the films that you've seen so far have sort of been in that general time frame of 60s to early 80s, but it's not. I'm not limiting. It's not limited to that era in terms of what we're curating. I mean, a lot of it comes down to availability, and I mean, it's sort of a balance between having an identity and doing something that people can see. I think you want to have some brand identity, but then at the same time, you can't limit yourself too much, because I want to make sure that I'm open, that I leave myself open for opportunities and don't close myself off from possible acquisitions and licenses.
I mean, the good news is that you've got like the people like me that have kind of been like spine number 1, 2, and 3, right? So it's like I gotta have 4 and 5 or whatever,
Yeah.
but then as you expand into like Walking the Edge, certainly is going to be like an 80s kind of, so like you get like people that are interested in that too, and then there's new discovery there that happens as well, so it's a good business move anyways. But when are you planning on being able to do theatrical again? Is that going to be like late 21?
We're in the process right now of theaters, just like in New York City, we're just able to start opening, not obviously, at a small capacity, but hopefully later this year. We have a title upcoming, which we've announced, which is a British film called Radio On, which is a road movie with an amazing soundtrack. David Bowie, Kraftwerk, Ian Dury, a lot of Robert Fripp. So it's a really cool. It's from 1979. So you get people with the soundtrack, and it's shot in black and white, and it's more of an art film, sort of like something that probably could be paired with, say, like Two Lane Blacktop, for instance. But that's a film that has a little more pedigree to it in terms of, like I said, it's more of an art house film. Yeah. And so that's something that we hope to do some theatrical with, and maybe some festival, some kind of festival premiere or something. We'll see later in this year. But again, it's just we don't know how things are going to go.
Totally.
But yeah, once put one foot in front of the other. But yeah, there's definitely, I'm definitely still interested in and committed to theatrical when it's there, when it's available, and within what makes financial sense. But you can still get certain press and certain awareness, certain levels of awareness, or certain types of coverage that you don't get when you just put a movie on disc, or when you just put it on digital platforms or something. There's still something a little old school in the business about like how movies are covered. And so if you do have a theatrical component, and there are, and the thing is that there are a lot of theaters now in the country, in New York especially, we're very lucky. And you're in Austin, so you've got like the Austin Film Society there. Mm-hmm. There's theaters that are very sympathetic and to repertory cinema, who make that a part of their programming. So it is something that people have, especially younger. It's interesting that it's people of our generation and younger who are maybe more interested in the repertory than older, the older folks in our business, because again, I think it goes back to what we were talking about before, that you see there's an interest. A lot of times there's more interest in the past, and things more. There's an interest in what you weren't there for. So sometimes it's harder, and I feel the same thing for things that, say, I was around for from the 90s. Mm-hmm. It was harder for me to sort of see them when it got to be like 10 or 15 years after the fact, to see the historical significance, because I was like, oh, I was there, and I don't have the same nostalgia for that stuff. But the things that I wasn't around for are more idealized because of the fact that I wasn't there, and and I always wanted to be a little older, so I could have been for it.
So we're pretty similar in age. Like the 90s was like kind of when I was in my kind of preteens and teens, and then that was like and I don't ever go back to like 90s film for like, that's never where I go. I mean, there's some good stuff there.
I will say though that in the last 10 years I have come to appreciate a lot of the 90s independent films that I was programming when I was in college, and that I was seeing in the theaters even before that, especially growing up outside of the city. And there is because it's kind of a lost. It is a type of film that's not really made anymore in terms of budget level, and in terms of the production quality, the level of the sort of there. It's kind of like you sort of have now like super micro budget, and then you just have massive massive comic book level budget, and you don't have as many of those types of more medium budget films that were considered independent films, in the 90s. It sort of migrated to television. A lot of that kind of storytelling, those types of films, more earthbound films, more character-based stuff is sort of is, I think, a lot of that stuff kind of again went to television, and we don't really have those in like a 2-hour, 90-minute to 2-hour format, which I kind of miss. I mean, long form television, has its place, but I still prefer seeing a feature film. I still prefer seeing something that starts and is resolved and what have you in a feature film length.
Man, John, this is really fun. I'm really enjoying talking to you. I feel like I could easily go another hour, but I know it's getting really super late for you. I guess just kind of maybe to wrap it up, or just kind of in the just out of respect for your time here. One of the things I'm always interested in is, you said you're a collector, so I don't know how open you kind of are with that, but are you open to talking about kind of like roughly how many films you have and kind of like how you think about collecting?
Sure. Honestly, I don't know how many titles I have, but I can tell you that I still have films I've been collecting since VHS, Laserdisc, DVD, Blu-ray. I even have some CEDs. I've never actually had a player. Some I just collect at this point because I like the packaging and the presentation of them. And there's inspiration there too, in terms of, packaging my stuff now. So I couldn't tell you how many, but I would say that I really I do try to stick more to things that I feel like I really need to have at this point. Need that'll vary from person to need is probably not really a need, but I'm just saying between having everything versus that's something I always want to have in my collection. I try to do that. Otherwise it gets out of control in terms of, I'm not as much about like, I want to have every spine number, but from the other side, as having my own label, sure, I would love to have everyone people say, yeah, I want to have every Fun City spine number. Yeah, absolutely.
The way that I've kind of shifted, as you're talking about kind of shifting, the way I've kind of shifted over the years is I think of like, I mean this in all sincerity, not just because I'm talking with you, but like, I want to put my dollars towards Fun City, towards Arbelos, towards Grindhouse Releasing, towards Massacre Video, like the ones that are like, you can tell it's a passion project, right? I mean, I'm sure there's a business side to it, but like, this is a passion project. It's like 2 to 4 releases a year, maybe 6 releases a year. It's like, there's just meticulous design, the packaging and care put into it. AGFA down here in Austin is a nice one.
Sure.
Where there's a level of preservation that's happening and kind of going into those deep cuts in people's filmographies that is important, because a lot of these titles haven't seen releases since VHS, if that sometimes. And so that's kind of where I'm biased towards putting dollars now. And then some of the box sets from the big like kind of massive boutique houses are too tempting to pass up. Like, they're beautiful.
And they're companies like Arrow are they're doing those beautifully. I'm not at that. I don't know. I don't have anything that ambitious yet in the slate, but at this point I'm just trying to get to maybe one release a month.
Okay.
But yeah, I totally respect that. It's sort of a you're seeing the value in the sort of more handcrafted, more curated, carefully put together package, and that's exactly what I've sought out to do, because there is a lot of competition for people's entertainment dollars, and I know that as a collector, it's like you, it's easy to, if you're choosing between one or two things, it certainly is more persuasive. It can be more persuasive if you say, oh, this has like this edition here has all these nice contextual extras that historicize this and kind of place this film versus another edition which is pretty bare bones.
Yeah, totally. Well, just respecting the artisanship that goes into it, I guess, right? Kind of in summary. I guess if you are open to one more question, I am curious from my side, just as a buyer.
Yeah.
Vinegar Syndrome feels like this extremely well kind of like oiled machine, right? They have like a ton of releases every month. They have like the archive line. They've got then their partner labels, right? So it's like
I'm a partner label. Yeah.
You what?
I'm one of their partner labels.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's like you, and then Utopia, and then a few others. There's Active, I think, is one. But anyways, you have like these kind of partner labels. That feels like a really sweet gig if you're like starting a business to kind of like go on the Vinegar Syndrome train and be seen as like somebody that they're promoting to the marketplace. It's like these guys are legit. Has that been good for you?
Yes, I would say absolutely. That's a good question. For sure, if I wasn't being sort of if I wasn't partnered with Vinegar Syndrome and it'd be a lot harder for me to get I wouldn't have the number of eyes that I have on me now. I've benefited from Vinegar Syndrome's established brand, loyalty, customers, their mode of operation, the way they do things. It's it's like you said, it's all very well thought out. And so I've certainly, I saw the value in that, and I'm experiencing that benefiting from that in a way that I wouldn't if I was on my own, or perhaps if I was being distributed by another company. Because they're very, I think they have been very savvy about, this is a niche market. So definitely they're doing something right. So I'm doing something a little bit different. It's a little bit the same and a little bit different. So I think it's a good, it's been a good match, a good match.
Wonderful.
So we come to the third film that we talk about today, which is Panique from Julien Duvivier, a French film from 1946. I probably didn't like this film as much as you guys did. I know, Chris, you liked it. So I'm going to let you start because, it's always nice to get a good start before I go in and tear it up.
Sure, no problem. So the basic premise is, after an elderly maid is murdered, opinions are manipulated, evidence is planted, violence erupts, and panic ensues. It's very dramatic.
That is very dramatic.
Very dramatic.
I think that there's this huge wave of documentaries that have come out on Netflix, especially, but I'm sure Prime as well. But anyways, they're just kind of available now on streaming, which are around, wrongful convictions. And one of the reasons I like this movie so much is, well, I'm sure we'll get into the set design, which is just breathtaking. But from a story perspective, one of the reasons I like this so much is it felt very progressive to be telling a story in this way in the 40s, of talking about kind of mob mentality and the dangers of making, decisions about somebody's innocence or guilt without actually knowing any of the details. And that's, again, like, this is something we could probably have a very politicalized, hateful podcast about. So without getting into all that, I think it's still going on today for sure. Regardless of kind of the political spectrum you're on, it's so easy to take three facts and then jump to this massive conclusion that this guy's a murderer before you really know one way or the other. So I just thought that was an interesting topic, kept me engaged. The main actor, Michel Simon, I like the fact that the way this film was shot, he looked like a hipster from 2020 or 2021. Like, I could have easily seen him having a YouTube channel during COVID. And so it felt very like present and current for me, even from the way it was shot, and timeless in the way that the sets were used and the story itself. So all that I just went into. I really thought this was a fantastic movie. I actually just put it in my top 100. I'm pretty sure it broke the top 20
awesome.
of my rolling 100. So, Zach, what
are
about you?
Saying it's kind of like an early cancel culture movie?
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. I mean, kind of. Yeah. What did you think, Zach?
I liked it. If I'll go ahead and kind of get the slight negatives out of the way. I do feel like it kind of runs its plot a little thin, even with its runtime. I feel like it's a story that can be told pretty shortly. It's a story that's kind of similar, at least towards the end of how the end of King Kong or Frankenstein. That it's the mob, it's the lynch that is worse than what we perceive as the monster itself. I think that's all really interesting. I think it's done really well on a more humanistic level than using giant apes and a reanimated dead corpse. But it's that sense of it's a good little story, and I did enjoy it. Like I said, I think my biggest issue really was just that I thought it ran a little long for what it was, and like the carnival scenes just kind of felt. I'm not gonna say unnecessary. I get why they're there, but I'm just like, there's a lot of carnival stuff here.
I'm kind of in the same boat. Like the plot's cool, and it's definitely very, very relevant with cancel culture and things like that. Maybe this isn't exactly like cancel culture because this guy is already pretty shunned anyway. It's not like they've completely flipped the perspective of like a very popular person in the town. They were kind of looking for a scapegoat anyway. It does kind of tie into a film that came out a couple of years prior from Clouseau, who did Le Diabolique, Le Corbeau. I don't know if you guys have seen that. Sort of similarly set in a French provincial town. This one's set like during the occupation, the Nazi occupation in France, and basically about this sort of these sort of letters that go out throughout the town accusing people of doing different things and blackmailing people and things like that, and that the whole town just ends up turning on each other. And again, it's about that sort of dangers of mob mentality, which this film is obviously very heavily leans on. Especially towards the end, the way they sort of manipulate the whole village into thinking Michel Simon is this bad guy when he's actually this sort of very quiet, nice, friendly gentleman. Just because he's a little bit of an oddball, everyone is instantly suspicious. Like one scene that completely, took me, or sort of shocked me was near the end where the guy in the butcher shop is asking the little girl, has he ever taken you up to his room? And I for like a film, this is 1946, and I was shocked, when that scene happened. I thought, like, wow, to be sort of insinuating this guy, like that they think this guy might even be a pedophile, was just completely shocking. But yeah, I think the plot overall is kind of a little bit thin. I joked about this in my review, and when I first watched it, I was surprised because it's so noirish. I was surprised it was never like remade in America. Like I can picture this film perfectly, directed by Fritz Lang, and then starring Joan Bennett and Dan Dury as the two sort of bad guys, and then poor Edward G. Robinson as the Michel Simon character. I could perfectly picture that happening. I was so surprised that it never happened because I think it would have suited them all down to the ground because it's such a noirish, plot. How it all happens, the little even the little things like the femme fatale aspect, and just even the little things. It's a very film noir kind of film. But yeah, I think the plot is just kind of spread a little bit thin. But I suppose we'll talk about the main thing that this film is great at, and that's the set design.
That stunt work was also really good. I just want to note before I forget, like the end.
Oh yeah.
For that time period, I was like, oh, that seems like actually like a difficult stunt to do.
Yeah, like one thing we cannot knock this film is its production. For sure. Like I couldn't really find. I tried looking into this. I don't know if you guys were able to find that much, but in terms of how much of the set was like built for the film, because it's so essentially. It's essentially a town that they've built, and really incredible sets, and the way that sort of Duvivier sort of explores the sets is excellent. Like the way he sort of shoots in the window of the femme fatale, and it pretty much mirrors how Michel Simon's character, who lives in the apartment across the road, sort of looks through his window in at hers. The camera sort of stalks just like he does. Yeah, the production of this film cannot be knocked. It was kind of, I had a similar feeling with the previous Duvivier film that I'd watched, Pepe Le Moko, which again, the plot is not great. It's very thin. Takes a lot of turns that just sort of, kind of just come out of nowhere. But again, the set design in that film to recreate a sort of Moroccan or Algerian Casbah is excellent as well. So Duvivier has a great eye for production design, and he makes his films look really great. Maybe he could have just done with. I see he co-wrote the screenplay on this as well. Maybe it's his writing that sort of brings the film down.
So Michel Gondry and Jean-Pierre Jeunet are probably two other French directors that would fall under this category, right? Of where the story is there to really service their creative kind of visual vision, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that's maybe they even were inspired by Duvivier, because like this, I really felt like this could have easily been a Michel Gondry movie. Like just the fact that like there was really no special effects, but there was an altered reality by the way, like the angles of the building and the way the camera was shot. And like, I don't know exactly how he did it, but I just felt like they created miniatures and then just somehow blew them up.
Yeah.
And I felt like it created a really cool kind of feeling and a timelessness to the movie, because it was obviously not any specific town. It kind of took you out of that reality and it made it fun and playful, which, yeah, again, I think those other two guys did as well.
Yeah, I suppose it's probably his way of saying that this could be any town, this could happen in any, because obviously I don't think the town is ever even named or anything like that. So I think it's giving it this sense of this could be happening anywhere, kind of like the way Lynch does that as well with his small towns, with the CD, the way like in a lot of Lynch projects, it's all about the seemingly idyllic small town with the seedy underbelly. Obviously, this isn't as weird as a David Lynch film, but sort of a similar idea of this. Obviously, he talks about small town America, the same way that sort of Duvivier in this film is talking about small town France or village France, or that in the seemingly idyllic locations, yes, there's still crime, yes, there's still negative things happening. People can get murdered, people can spread rumors, and it can be the downfall of other people. So as much as this is maybe a sort of reflection on human nature and how greed or the sort of can't really describe the emotion of why they would go after this character specifically, but the fact that they were the femme fatale and her boyfriend were so strongly wanting to get away with this murder that they would just pin it on this sort of just nice guy. Instead of being about human nature, it's kind of more about the idea that small towns can have this sort of negative sort of undercurrent just as much as a city can.
And this is always the possibility of reading too much into it, but I always feel like when you're dealing with movies in Europe, from specifically Europe, but in the US too, about like in the mid 1940s to mid 1950s, you kind of got to bring World War II into it a little bit, to the sense that, I don't want to sit there and say it represents anti-Semitism or that, France, of course, was under Third Reich control for World War II, and then you have this guy who, based on his looks, is decided that he's guilty because he's a big bear of a guy, and almost gives this like animalistic quality to him, similar to how people were convinced of how Nazis were able to get control of that. And like I said, possibly could be reading too much into it, but that's kind of how I felt with the context of the year and the location and all that other stuff.
No, I completely agree with that sentiment. Like even like France, especially, I think the idea of trust was a huge issue, because obviously France, a lot of France during World War II was governed by French people, known as Vichy France. They were German installed, they were loyal to the Nazis, but they were French, so they essentially turned on other French people to sort of instill this Nazi rule. So this idea of trust, and that your neighbor could be someone who is not trustworthy and will sort of turn their back on you or will attack you and your ideas, then, and it's explored heavily in the Corbeau as well, which is why I keep sort of referring back to that film, especially the fact that that was shot and filmed during Nazi occupation. It would have been a massive thing in France because of that whole Vichy thing, where like after World War II ended, if you were found that you were had played any part in the Nazis succeeding, so if you were not in like the resistance, if you were played any part in Vichy France, you were shunned, you were thrown out, you were executed. They didn't want anything to do with you. So this similar idea of being suspicious of your neighbor, and I suppose it's kind of like you'll see a lot of this stuff in 50s American films, the whole Red Scare. It's just this idea of trust of your neighbor and how being, seeing someone who's potentially untrustworthy can create this problem in the sort of wider society, that they'll go after you and that they'll try and hurt you, basically.
That's interesting, because the McCarthyism in the U.S., when was that? When were all the directors getting blacklisted?
That's the 50s, yeah.
Yeah, 50s and early 60s.
That was all just based on word of mouth, right? Like, oh, this person's
like Trumbo and all that, and having to deal with being blacklisted and going under fake names.
Yeah, or just going and making films in Europe, like Dassin had to do, and like obviously he had to go to France, and Joseph Losey, he had to go to the UK and he made films in France, or he just ended up like Charlie Chaplin and just never make a film again. So until like, didn't he make his last film, I think, in like the 60s or the 70s or something? Maybe I'm misremembering. But yeah, this definitely ties in with that idea of suspicion and just that sort of post-World War II paranoia that was just rife all around the world, really, for different reasons. Obviously, in France, it's because literally your own neighbor could have turned against you during World War II. And obviously in America, it's about the whole sort of pure fear of communism. So basically what we're saying is Panique and The Blob are interchangeable films. You can watch either and get the same idea from them.
Yeah, I can't really think of too much else to say. I mean, this is a movie that I really enjoyed, but it is fairly straightforward in its execution.
Did anyone else feel like the ending of this was like Elevator to the Gallows?
Ooh, interesting.
Like as soon as he like picks up that picture, I was like, it's the first thing I thought about.
Yeah, because
the truth is in the picture.
Yeah, because that was the sort of the red handprint, wasn't it? That similar in Elevator to the Gallows, he shows the picture that shows Jean Moreau in the in the same area. Yeah, no, now that you've said that, yeah, for sure I can see that connection there. I think this one is kind of left a bit more open-ended, I suppose, because they're sort of on the carnival ride and we don't know what's going to happen. Is he going to try and escape? Is he going to accept his fate? We don't really know. But yeah, that photo as a sort of proof of the crime is an interesting connection. I didn't make that connection myself.
I guess if we're talking briefly about the ending, so spoiler alert here a little bit, but I think I liked that the ending was open because it kind of left with the feeling of you don't even know for sure that the police are going to prosecute this guy, right? Even though
because they would look bad on them,
right?
Yeah, because the town don't even really trust the police. When they're deciding that Michel Simon is the bad guy, I think someone says, "Oh, let's call the police," and they're like, "No, let's just take it into our own hands." So yeah, maybe the police will just let this one go as well. Maybe they don't want to open up that can of worms. It leaves the film at an ambiguous note, which I have no problem with. I don't mind an ambiguous ending, as long as there's enough pieces for you to try and put it together yourself. A cliffhanger ending and an ambiguous ending are different stories, but yeah, a film like this where it leaves little morsels or little sort of jigsaw pieces that gives you enough to maybe put something together afterwards, whether you think the police will, they have the picture, they have the proof, they're waiting for him to get off the carnival ride, let's just go get him, or the police are already not trusted enough to do their job. Maybe they'll just say, let's just say he was the killer and move on.
Yeah, more important to be in line with the public perception than to find the actual criminal who did it, right?
Yeah, and again, that's another. I think this film, like now that we've talked about it, maybe it's grown on me a little bit more. It's still a film that has relevance today, both in terms of its mob mentality, cancel culture, if you will, sort of trust of law enforcement, trust of your neighbor, even, because I suppose even now with anti-maskers and anti-vaxxers and stuff, your own aunt could go on a rant on Facebook about how vaccines are going to kill children. So it's another, one of those themes that is still just as relevant today, really. You don't know what your neighbors sort of believe in and where their allegiances lie. So if anything you can take from this film is that even though it was made, best part of sort of 70 years ago or so, its themes are just as relevant today as they were then.
Yeah.
So as usual, we're just going to wrap up with any other business where we'll just talk about something we watched recently that we liked. Doesn't have to be Criterion related, doesn't have to be good, just something that we want to give a shout out to. Zach, do you want to talk about something briefly that you've seen that you liked?
Well, I've been on a Snyder kick, so I guess I will talk about that here since I don't have much else besides what we've already talked about. And I'm debating if I should talk more about Sucker Punch or talk more about his Justice League that just released. I guess I'll sort of touch on both. First, Sucker Punch, it's one of those films that was highly hated when it came out. I just recently saw it. It's one that was on the back burner for me. I kind of encourage people to go back and maybe give it a second chance because I think it was one of those films that was really misread, and that could be because of Snyder's fault, but I think it's worth a second look. The other one is his Justice League, which obviously had a 4-year campaign to get it released. And in a sense of whether you're a fan or not, if you just like to keep up with modern movies and how studio systems work, I really recommend people at least check it out, even if they're not Snyder fans, to at least give it a chance to, because I think it's important. I think it's important in the history of where we're at currently. I think it's something that could possibly, I'm not going to say it is going to set a precedent, but it has that potential to. And I think it really says a lot for what audiences are telling studios, because we've had years of studios are allowed to cut films all to pieces and we just accept it and say, well, we'll get a director's cut like Blade Runner, 25 years later, where we can see the actual vision. And now it's a demand that no, the director's vision should be seen regardless. It shouldn't be up to studios to decide what should be seen and what should not. Be interesting to see how that, if that echoes anywhere into the studio system as the years go on. But I think it's important. That's all I'm really going to say. I'm not really going to talk about the film itself because I think you're kind of going to know what you're getting into with the Zack Snyder film.
I mean, tied to that preservation discussion, even if it's just a matter of choice, right? Giving people an option if they want to see the theatrical cut or the director's cut.
For me,
absolutely, and it's one of those deals as well, that as much as I hate like the idea that all like 2 or 3 companies own all these movies, AT&T bought out Time Warner, but if it wasn't for AT&T buying out Time Warner, we would have never seen this. So, I got to give credit where credit's due. AT&T saw that people were interested and gave $70 million to make sure it happens when Warner Brothers wanted this thing buried as far as possible.
The only thing that makes me pessimistic about this idea of hashtag release the Snyder Cut kind of things is I'm wondering that if the original was any way good, no, the original's terrible. The original Justice League is a bad, bad movie. If it was any way good, I don't think there would have been calls for it. So for me, I think maybe I'm just completely misreading this and maybe I'm a little bit biased because I'm an MCU fanboy, but I think a lot of the reason why people were wanting the Snyder Cut was a need for vindication that the Justice League can be good. And I think if Joss Whedon's vision was good, or at least better than what it was, I don't think there would have been calls for this Snyder Cut. I think rather than people wanting the director's original vision, it's this was terrible, please. Zack Snyder's version can't be worse. Let's get this out and hopes that we can vindicate ourselves and we can try and say, oh, that we're better than Marvel. And that's the way it kind of sat with me. And I used to work for Vero. I don't know if you're aware of the social media company. It's one that Zack Snyder is heavily involved in. I used to work for them. So I've seen a lot of this stuff when it first started rolling out about 3 or 4 years ago when people were demanding the Snyder Cut. I was right in there deep seeing these posts on Vero about it. So I know about this whole sort of mob mentality and these sort of Snyder fanboys and the DC fanboys. And a lot of it is not about whether or not they want Zack Snyder's original vision. It's more that they want something good so that they can say, haha, we're better than you, Marvel.
And I guess, I'm not as much into that. Like, I obviously, he brings a lot of passion. I try to stay away from any fandoms. It doesn't matter if it's Star Wars or anything. I just find them all pretty toxic and not beneficial in a lot of ways. So I just try to kind of separate myself from that. I guess from the circles I'm in, it's, I didn't care if the movie was any better. And this is, I guess, just a personal thing for me. It could have been worse. It could have been the worst superhero movie I've ever seen. But I still think it should have came out. The idea that a studio can butcher a film this horribly and get away with it, I think is just a bad idea. I think that itself sets a bad precedent. The idea that, the idea of being commercialized, to the idea of, we don't care about vision, we care about, there was this almost like this separation between Snyder and WB. WB wanted to compete with Marvel, and Snyder was always very open that he had no interest in competing with Marvel. His interest was making his own thing and doing that. And I think that's why that relationship got so strained, is because, for better or worse, Snyder made the movies he wanted to make, and WB just got tired of it and just decided they were going to pull the rug and say, you know what, we're going to commercialize to you, we're going to franchise this, and it doesn't matter. And I just think it's bad for the genre itself, the idea of superhero movies, they need to be Marvelized. And this isn't a knock on Marvel, not at all. What Marvel's done is great and it's accomplishment, but it's not the only way to do things. And I think that's the importance of this sort of thing. Even, like I said, I don't know if, I'm sure there is a DC versus Marvel angle to this. There always has been. But from my personal opinion, that really didn't factor into this.
Cool. Then why do you have a Superman tattoo on your cheek?
Do I? Did not come off?
Yeah. I know you brought up Sucker Punch as well when you were going. I read your review on it. I thought it was really well written, and I think you had a quote from Jenna Malone.
Yeah.
And I grew up with Jen. We're very similar in age. I think she may be a year or two younger, but we're very similar in age, and so she was an early crush of mine.
Okay.
And so I brought back some good memories. But I do. It's interesting because there's that tension between over-sexualizing young girls in Hollywood, right? And then in this movie, which, I mean, does that, but for the actresses themselves, saying, like, it was super empowering, and it was cool to see these women that had so many constraints around them, being in the hospital and all this, but they were able to escape into this fantasy where they were like these assassins and powerful and kind of superheroes in a way. I thought that was an interesting perspective. I'm glad you included her quote on that, just to see what she thought.
Yeah, I always felt that was more of a commentary on geek culture itself, and it's funny coming from Snyder, who's been a huge fan of a huge part of geek culture, and he's obviously, deep into it. But, when I was watching the movie, and, that stuff I've heard for years, I never felt like it was supposed to over-sexualize them and just make them, something to stare at. Now, obviously, how successful he is going to be at person to person, but I personally never felt that.
Cool.
I suppose to talk about sort of one sort of feminist angle to another, the film I'm going to talk about, well, I suppose production-wise, it couldn't be farther from a Warner Brothers action flick. It's a 1952 film from Finland, which is a cinematic landscape I'd never explored. It was a really beautiful film. It's called The White Reindeer. I got the release from Eureka here in Region B. Really, really nice Blu-ray set. This really incredible sort of intimate, sort of supernatural kind of folk horror. I spoke about Kuroneko a few weeks back, and this was kind of similar, just in terms of its atmosphere and its sort of otherworldliness to it. So it was completely set and filmed in Lapland, which is a region like at the very sort of north of Finland, really sort of tundra, barren, snowy era. The sort of culture there is very similar to like Eskimo culture in Canada. So it's really, really interesting. A sort of part of the world I'd never seen depicted in film before, and that in itself was interesting. The plot was fantastic, though. It's basically about this young woman. She marries a hunter, but she becomes very, very lonely because the hunter, he's always away on hunting trips and things like that. So she's basically just sitting in the house alone for long periods of time. And it's very much about this sort of sexual frustration and wanting to be loved and wanting to feel free. And she eventually goes to a shaman who tells her about this ritual about how she can basically make herself alluring to men. And the ritual involves her going to this sort of they call it the stone god, basically this statue they have in the middle of nowhere, and she sacrifices this white reindeer fawn in order to go ahead with the ritual. But the shaman, like all of these kind of folky horror films, the shaman didn't tell her the full story, and she basically becomes this sort of vampiric shapeshifter that becomes a white reindeer and lures men out to the wilderness and kills them. And so it's completely bonkers film, but it's just so beautiful to look at. The cinematography was done by the director as well, this guy called Eric Blomberg. And he just made this incredible film in the absolute middle of nowhere in the north of Finland. It's beautiful looking. The plot is really, really interesting. It's a very short film. I think it was only about 70 something minutes long. So it definitely does not overstay its welcome at any point. And it just has this really terrific atmosphere, very similar to something like Kuroneko or Ani Baba, where, you know, it's not really, I wouldn't really call it like a horror film. It's even very much in line with something like The Witch, like the Robert Eggers films. I'd very much sort of put it in the same kind of horror category as that, the sort of slow, atmospheric kind of horror film where it doesn't really rely on scares, just more so about just the atmosphere. Yeah, The White Reindeer, I don't know if there's a Region A release. I should have looked it up, but I didn't, so I apologize. But you guys are about Region Free anyway, so Eureka have a Region B of it, but I'd really recommend it, especially if you like those kind of slower, more atmospheric horror films. Definitely a recommend for that.
Sounds really good. My biggest question is, does Santa Claus make an appearance?
He does not, unfortunately. I was disappointed as well.
Yeah. That's his hometown.
Plenty of reindeer. Yeah, Lapland is his hometown. Plenty of reindeer. None of them fly and none of them have red noses, but there's plenty of reindeer and plenty of sleighs in the film, but no Santa, unfortunately.
Maybe the movie was made by a disgruntled elf who was trying to create a different opinion of the Lapland culture, who was so tired of only being seen as a Santa culture.
I can see that. Yeah, I can see that. Counterculture in a way of Lapland, yeah.
We do not have a Region A of that. Not Region A, but we don't have a U.S. release. And I don't know if the other one, I'm trying to look it up, if the Masters of Cinema one is.
I can tell you right now if it's region free, if you give me 2 seconds.
It says it's region locked on Blu-ray.
Okay, well, I'm not going to bother tear apart my shelf to try and get it out because I stack my stuff rather than put them side by side. So, but yeah, well, look, you guys are region free, and if anyone else is listening is region free, or if they're like me in region B, Eureka's release of The White Reindeer, I think I picked it up for like 12 quid on Amazon. So it's not going to set you back a whole lot, and it's just a really cool, interesting little film from a piece of the world where you don't get a lot of cinema from. Obviously, you get a lot of film from Sweden, but you don't really see a lot from Finland. So it's interesting even for that point alone, just seeing a part of the world that you wouldn't normally see expressed in the cinematic language.
From the snowy tundra of Lapland to the grimy 80s synth-filled streets of the 80s in the US, I'll take us in a slightly different direction for mine. So I just finished. Vinegar Syndrome has a line that they put out called their archive line. So far, there's 12 releases. Some of the releases have multiple films, so it winds up being about 15 films total. And it's the kind, for anybody that doesn't know, the theme of Vinegar Syndrome Archive is VHS classics. So it's the kind of things, they actually run the Vinegar Syndrome guys actually run a video store in Connecticut. And so they have this backlog of just VHS stuff that's sitting there for years. And I know, Zach, on the other podcast, your co-host is a huge VHS collector.
Mm-hmm.
So he's probably familiar with some of these titles, but for the most part, I hadn't heard of any of these. And they're just, kind of forgotten classics that have never had sometimes even a DVD release, but the people at Vinegar Syndrome like. So I'm going to be putting together. I don't think I can do a ranking piece yet because they're still putting them out. Like they're not done. But I'll put together at least a kind of brief overview of all of them for the site. But I think the top 5 for me, Action USA, just because it's one of my favorite movies, anyways. Then there's another one called Savage Dawn, which is imagine Mad Max made for about $100.
So
yeah, and in a town where there's no real consequence because they don't have anything of value to fight for. It's just people that are fighting for their town because it's their town.
That's the one with the guy Lance Henriksen. Yeah, I remember you did a review on it for the site a while ago. Yeah, Lance Henriksen.
Yeah, it was great. I would say it's my favorite one, but then Action USA is in the collection, so you can't be it. Spellcaster, which is like, imagine if MTV were to make a promotional horror film that was just kind of about how cool it is to be a VJ. I don't really know how else to describe that. It's a weird idea for a film. I can't believe it got off the ground, and I understand why this is the first release, but it was good. It was well done. And then L.A. Wars, which is kind of like Godfathers meets The Godfather, not Godfathers. I don't know what Godfathers is. The Godfather, again, made for about $100, and sort of poorly written. And then number 5 would be Savage Harbor, which I'm putting up there just because I laughed so hard at. So Sylvester Stallone brother Frank and Robert Mitchum's brother Chris star in this movie about 2 dock workers that come in from time to time and try to find love and get involved in some criminal activity that, unintentionally, and have to fight their way out. But the funny thing is that Frank Stallone on the special features said when the movie was finished, he took it over to his brother's house, Sly. And they sat there and they said they both were laughing and tears were streaming down their face. Their bellies hurt. And afterwards, Sylvester Stallone was like, "This is the worst movie ever made." And so for that story alone, I'll rank it high, and I think it's a fun one to watch.
Nice.
That wraps up this week's episode of They Live by Film. If you want to read more of our thoughts, visit theylivebyfilm.com. And you can also follow our Letterboxd, Reddit, and Instagram accounts from the links in the description. For now, take care.